Rieccoci ad ascoltare Spare dopo tanto tempo. Dunque, che cosa è successo? Quando io ho iniziato questa rubrica in cui ascoltiamo insieme Spare, ascoltavamo nelle prime puntate, nei primi episodi insieme e poi io commentavo interrompendo ogni tanto la registrazione. Poi qualcuno di voi sicuramente, lo sento, lo percepisco, non ho motivo di pensare il contrario, mi ha consigliato nei commenti di levare la parte in cui ascoltiamo Spare insieme e semplicemente produrre dei video in cui io vi riassumo il libro. Io ti ringrazio per questo consiglio che tra l'altro ho seguito, come potete vedere negli episodi successivi, soltanto che non ti ritengo responsabile, zero rancore, ma mi hai fatto droppare le views, perché se nei primi video magari arrivavo a delle views che sfioravano i 1000, poi quindi nel frattempo purtroppo hanno rivoluzionato i sottotitoli di YouTube e quindi non ci sono più i sottotitoli in italiano, non funzionano. Io riprendo questa rubrica perché io non sono un tipo che lascia le cose in sospeso e onestamente sono anche curioso di continuare a vedere che cosa è scritto in questo libro. E tra le altre cose, per noi appassionati di Royal Family, Spare è uno di quei libri che, se per esempio immaginassimo che la Royal Family è un corso di università, sarebbe un libro obbligatorio. Quindi riattivo questa rubrica con il formato che avevo pensato originalmente. Ti ringrazio per il consiglio. Consiglio a chi mi ha consigliato di cambiare formato: non dare consigli, lascia perdere. Ti ringrazio, io l'ho seguito perché sono uno che si fa consigliare, però in quel caso forse era meglio che continuavo per come l'avevo ideato io. Mi dispiace che dovremmo continuare con i sottotitoli in italiano, ma se tanto mi dà tanto, è possibile che... avevo perso di vista la camera. È possibile che nel video che produco io, quindi quello che state vedendo voi, potete attivare comunque i sottotitoli in italiano, perché io non dovrei avere... Comunque sia, mi dispiace... non è un mio volere quello di escludere le persone che non parlano inglese, però non dipende da me, YouTube, che ha questo problema. Allora, per fare un piccolo catch up, l'ultima cosa che è successa nel racconto di Spare è che Harry scopre attraverso Marco che glielo racconta che un giornalista vuole pubblicare un articolo di giornale in cui essenzialmente la narrativa è che Harry è un drogato. Scopre che tra altre cose questo giornalista è stato, diciamo, informato da uno schizzacervelli che, a quanto pare, da quello che dice Harry, ha dei contatti con Camilla.
I went back to Eton trying to put all this out of my mind, tried to focus on my schoolwork, tried to be calm.
Calma.
I listened over and over to my go-to soothing CD, Sounds of the Okavango. 40 tracks. Crickets. Baboons. Rainstorm. Thunder. Birds. Lions and hyenas scrapping over a kill. At night, shutting off the lights, I'd hit play. My room sounded like a tributary of the Okavango. It was the only way I could sleep. After a few days, the meeting with Marco receded from consciousness. It began to...
Io non riuscirei mai a dormire ascoltando le iene che mangiano le carcasse. Cioè già mi viene difficile dormire ascoltando tipo i suoni della foresta, la pioggia, il vento, mi viene da fare la pipì.
Feel like a nightmare. But then I woke to the actual nightmare. A blaring front page headline. Harry's drug shame. January 2002. Spread over 7 pages inside the newspaper were all the lies Marco had presented to me, and many more. The story not only had me down as a habitual drug user, it had me recently going to rehab. Rehab. The editor had got her mitts on some photos of Marco, and me paying a visit to a suburban rehab center months earlier, a typical part of my princely charitable work. And she'd repurposed the photos, made them visual aids for her libelous fiction. I gazed at the photos and read the story in shock. I felt sickened, horrified. I imagined everyone, all my countrymen and countrywomen, reading these things, believing them. I could hear people all across the Commonwealth gossiping about me. Crikey, the boy's a disgrace. His poor dad, after all he's been through. More, I felt heartbroken at the idea that this had been partly the work of my own family, my own father and future stepmother. They'd abetted this nonsense. For what? To make their own lives a bit easier? I'd phoned Willie. I couldn't speak. He couldn't either. He was sympathetic, and more. Raw deal, Harold. At moments he was even angrier about the whole thing than I was, because he was privy to more details about the spin doctor and the backroom dealings that had led to this public sacrifice of the spare. And yet, in the same breath, he assured me that there was nothing to be done. This was Pa. This was Camilla. This was royal life. This was our life.
Certo che se è vero fanno queste cose, cioè se veramente c'è l'approvazione di suo padre per favorire Camilla, di sua nonna, sono degli stronzi. Cioè, ma chi cazzo se ne frega di Camilla, scusatemi. C'è tuo nipote di mezzo, c'è tuo figlio di mezzo. Posso capire, diciamo, il punto di vista di Harry che si è trovato in questa situazione e che poi ne è uscito nel modo in cui ne è uscito, uscendo dalla famiglia. Lo posso capire assolutamente, anche se poi dici è andato a stare con una peggio, sì, però quantomeno ti allontani dalla famiglia. Dal punto di vista di una persona traumatizzata lo comprendo, cioè finisci per odiare la tua famiglia quando vedi che ti fanno finire sui giornali con certe testate, se è vero.
Owned Marco. He too offered sympathy. I asked him to remind me, what was this editor's name? He said it, and I committed it to memory, but in the years since then I've avoided speaking it, and I don't wish to repeat it here. Spare the reader, but also myself. Besides, can it possibly be a coincidence that the name of the woman who pretended I went to rehab is a perfect anagram for Rahaba Cooks?
Che poi, scusate, se lui adesso è, diciamo, in tribunale contro i media, e se la sua famiglia ha fatto una cosa del genere quando le pubblicazioni sono false, perché non denuncia la sua famiglia, per esempio?
Is the universe not saying something there? Who am I not to listen? Over several weeks, newspapers continued to rehash the Rahaba Cooks libels, along with various new and equally fabricated accounts of goings-on in Club H. Our fairly innocent teenage clubhouse was made to sound like Caligula's bedchamber. Around this time, one of Pa's dearest friends came to Highgrove. She was with her husband. They asked me to give them a tour. I walked them around the gardens, but they didn't care about Pa's lavender and honeysuckle. The woman asked eagerly, "Where's Club H?" An avid reader of all the papers. I led her to the door.
Non so se ve ne rendete conto, però la riproduzione dei sottotitoli non è, diciamo, la cosa più accurata. Club Age non è Club Age, ma è Club H, H di Harry. Per esempio molte parole come pa, che a volte viene pronunciata pe, e papà, starebbe pia, e a volte non viene neanche riportata per iscritto. Comunque se capite l'inglese, diciamo che ci si orienta. Non è, diciamo, la migliore delle traduzioni.
Opened it.
Delle
I
riproduzioni.
pointed down the dark steps. She breathed in deeply, smiled. Oh, it even smells of weed. It didn't, though. It smelt of damp earth, stone, and moss. It smelt of cut flowers, clean dirt, and maybe a hint of beer. Lovely smell, totally organic. But the power of suggestion had taken hold of this woman. Even when I swore to her that there was no weed, that we'd never once done drugs down there, she gave me a wink. I thought she was going to ask me to sell.
Però onestamente voi ci credereste ad Harry se vi dicesse non abbiamo mai utilizzato droga in questo locale? C'hai un rifugio segreto. Ormai noi lo sappiamo che ha fatto uso di queste sostanze perché lo ha detto già in questo nelle parti precedenti. Quindi diciamo, i giornalisti sono già malpensanti di loro per natura. È
Back,
difficile credere.
our family was no longer getting larger. There were no new spouses on the horizon, no new babies. My aunts and uncles, Sophie and Edward, Fergie and Andrew, had stopped growing their families. Pa, too, of course. An era of stasis had set in. But now, in 2002, it dawned on me, dawned on all of us, that the family wasn't static after all. We were about to get smaller. Princess Margaret and Gan were both unwell. I didn't know Princess Margaret, whom I called Aunt Margot. She was my great-aunt. Yes, we shared 12.5% of our DNA. We spent the bigger holidays together, and yet she was almost a total stranger. Like most Britons, I mainly knew of her. I was conversant with the general contours of her sad life. Great loves thwarted by the palace. Exuberant streaks of self-destruction splashed across the tabloids. One hasty marriage, which looked doomed at the outset and ended up being worse than expected. Her husband leaving poisonous notes around the house, scolding lists of things wrong with her. 24 reasons why I hate you. Growing up, I felt nothing for her, except a...
Effettivamente anche la riproduzione di The Crown della principessa Margaret diciamo, la ritrae come una persona molto, diciamo, snob, molto altezzosa, molto, diciamo, sempre con la puzza sotto il naso. Non faccio difficoltà a credere a queste parole di Harry. E anche lei aveva, secondo me, un'aria più... Secondo me era più difficile della regina come carattere.
A bit of pity and a lot of jumpiness. She could kill a houseplant with one scowl. Mostly, whenever she was around, I kept my distance. On those rarer than rare occasions when our paths crossed, when she deigned to take notice of me, to speak to me, I'd wonder if she had any opinion of me. It seemed that she didn't. Or else, given her tone, her coldness, the opinion wasn't much. Then one Christmas, she cleared up the mystery. The whole family gathered to open gifts on Christmas Eve. As always, a German tradition that survived the anglicizing of the family surname from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor. We were at Sandringham in a big room with a long table covered with white cloth and white name cards.
Scusatemi, darsi i regali la notte di Natale è una tradizione tedesca? Io non lo sapevo. Allora siamo tedeschi pure noi? Seguiamo la tradizione tedesca?
By custom, at the start of the night, each of us located our place, stood before our mound of presents. Then suddenly, everyone began opening at the same time. A free-for-all, with scores of family members talking at once and pulling out bows and tearing at wrapping paper. Standing before my pile, I chose to open the smallest present first. The tag said, "From Aunt Margot." I looked over, called out, "Thank you, Aunt Margot. I do hope you like it, Harry." I tore off the paper. It was a biro? I said,
A biro,
"Oh,
una penna.
a biro. Wow." She said, "Yes, a biro." I said, "Thank you so much." But it wasn't just any biro, she pointed out. It had a tiny rubber fish wrapped around it. I said, "Oh, a fish biro. Okay." I told myself, that is cold-blooded. Now and then, as I grew older, it struck me that Aunt Margot and I should have been friends.
Essenzialmente tu c'hai la prozia principessa e ti regala una biro a forma di pesce. Cioè proprio si è sprecata questo regalo, veramente.
We had so much in common. 2 spares. Our relationship with Granny wasn't an exact analogue of mine with Willie, but pretty close. The simmering rivalry, the intense competition, driven largely by the older sibling, it all looked familiar. Aunt Margot also wasn't that dissimilar from Mummy. Both rebels, both labelled as sirens. Pablo Picasso was among the many men obsessed with Margot. So my first thought when I learned in early 2002 that she'd been taken ill was to wish there'd been more time to get to know her. But we were well past that. She was unable to care for herself. After badly burning her feet in a bath, she was confined to a wheelchair and said to be swiftly declining. When she died, February 9, 2002, my first thought was that this would be a heavy blow to Gan Gan, who was also in decline.
Infatti.
Granny tried to talk Gan Gan out of attending the funeral, but Gan Gan dragged herself out of her sickbed, and shortly after that day took a bad fall. It was Pa who told me she'd been confined to her bed at Royal Lodge, the sprawling country house in which she'd lived part-time for the last 50 years, when she wasn't at her main residence, Clarence House. Royal Lodge was 3 miles south of Windsor Castle, still in Windsor Great Park, still part of the Crown estate, but like the castle it had one foot in another world. Dizzyingly high ceilings, pebbled driveway winding serenely through vivid gardens. Built not long after the death of Cromwell. I felt comforted to hear that Gan Gan was there, a place I knew she loved. She was in her own bed, Pe said, and not suffering. Granny was often with her. Days later, at Eton, while studying, I took the call. I wish I could remember whose voice was at the other end. A courtier, I believe. I recall that it was just before Easter, the weather bright and warm, light slanting through my window, filled with vivid colors. Your Royal Highness, the Queen Mother has died. Cut to Willie and me, days later. Dark suits, downcast faces, eyes filled with déjà vu. We walked slowly behind the gun carriage, bagpipes playing, hundreds of them. The sound threw me back in time. I began shaking. Once again, we made that hideous trek to Westminster Abbey. Then we stepped into a car, joined the cortege. From the centre of town, along Whitehall, out to the Mall, on to St. George's Chapel. Throughout that morning, my eye kept going to the top of Gan Gan's coffin, where they'd set the crown. Its 3,000 diamonds and jewelled cross winked in the spring sunlight. At the centre of the cross was a diamond the size of a cricket ball. Not just a diamond, actually, the great diamond of the world, a 105-carat monster called the Koh-i-Noor, largest diamond ever seen by human eyes. Acquired by the British Empire at its zenith. Stolen, some thought. I'd heard it was mesmerizing, and I'd heard it was cursed. Men fought for it, died for it, and thus the curse was said to be masculine. Only women were permitted to wear it. Strange after so much mourning, to just party. But months later came the Golden Jubilee, 50th anniversary of Granny's reign. Over 4 days that summer of 2002, Willie and I were constantly pulling on another set of smart clothes, jumping into another black car, rushing to yet another venue for another party or parade, reception or gala. Britain was intoxicated. People did jigs in the streets, sang from balconies and rooftops. Everyone wore some version of the Union Jack. In a nation known for its reticence, this was a startling expression of unbridled joy. Startling to me anyway. Granny didn't seem startled. I was startled at how unstartled she was. It wasn't that...
Ovvio, scusa, dopo 50 anni di regno c'è un poco abituata a vedere il tripudio delle folle. L'ha visto per il suo matrimonio, per qualsiasi altro matrimonio reale, per qualsiasi altro giubileo. Che io ho la sensazione profonda che comunque sia Harry, pur essendo nato all'interno di questa famiglia, non ne ha capito i meccanismi. Non è stato in grado di spiegare a Meghan che cosa vuol dire entrare all'interno della famiglia reale, motivo per cui lei, se è vera questa sorpresa, questo shock culturale che ha sentito, lo ha sentito. Non... In un certo senso lui stesso parla di questa famiglia come qualcosa di cui non fa parte. Per esempio dice, ah, ma il Commonwealth è il colonialismo 2.0. Ora, finché lo dico io, che sono una persona che comunque sia non ha nessun contatto con questa famiglia, ci sta, e non lo direi mai perché so benissimo che il Commonwealth ha delle prerogative completamente diverse dall'impero coloniale britannico, ma lo dice lui, che è il nipote della regina. Un po' anche attraverso queste parole comunque sia ritorna questa mancanza di consapevolezza da parte di Harry di aver capito chi è e dove si trova. Forse il fatto che lui sia uscito dalla famiglia ha un po' rimesso a posto le cose, perché effettivamente era un po' pesce fuor d'acqua.
But she felt no emotions. On the contrary, I always thought that Granny experienced all the normal human emotions. She just knew better than the rest of us mortals how to control them. I stood beside or behind her through much of the Golden Jubilee weekend, and I often thought, if this can't shake her, then she's truly earned her reputation for imperturbable serenity. In which case, I thought, maybe I'm a foundling, because I'm a nervous wreck. There were several reasons for my nerves, but the main one was a brewing scandal. Just before the Jubilee, I'd been summoned by one of the courtiers to his little office, and without much build-up he'd asked, "Harry, are you doing cocaine?" Shades of my lunch with Marco. What? Am I? How cool? No. Well, could there be a photo out there? Is it possible that someone somewhere might have a photo of you doing cocaine? God, no. That's ridiculous. Why? He explained that he'd been approached by a newspaper editor who claimed to have come into possession of a photo showing Prince Harry snorting a line. He's a liar. It's not true, I see. Be that as it may, this editor is willing to lock the photo into his safe forever. But in exchange, he wants to sit down with you and explain that what you're doing is very damaging. He wants to give you some life advice. Ah, creepy. And devious. Diabolical, in fact, because if I agree to this meeting, then I'm admitting guilt. Right. I told myself. After Rehaba Cooks, they all want to go at me. She'd scored a direct hit, and now her competitors are lining up to be next. When will it end? I reassured myself that the editor had nothing, that he was just fishing. He must have heard a rumor, and he was tracking it down. Stay the course, I told myself, and then I told the courtier to call the journalist's bluff, vigorously refute the claim, turn down the deal. Above all, reject the proffered meeting. I'm not going to submit to blackmail. The courtier nodded. Done. Of course, I had been doing cocaine around this time. At someone's country house, during a shooting weekend, I'd been offered a line, and I'd done a few more cents. It wasn't much fun, and it didn't make me particularly happy, as it seemed to make everyone around me, but it did make me feel different, and that was the main goal. Feel different. I was a deeply...
Certo che è furbo da parte sua il fatto di capire che era un semplice bluff, perché se tu lo fai, cioè devi comunque avere la paura, non devi, però è normale che tu abbia la paura, il presentimento che se qualcuno ti prende alla sprovvista e ti dice ci possono essere delle foto, tu che ne sai se qualcuno non ha fatto una foto per tradirti. Sagace. Non è molto altrettanto furbo, diciamo, a parlarne qui nel libro, perché poi con tutti i guai che questa cosa gli sta causando, sempre se secondo me non gli fanno niente, non lo deportano. Però per il visto americano non è stato, in vista del fatto che si trovava già in America, ci doveva pensare comunque sia prima di scrivere sta cosa nel libro. Non è stato molto...
unhappy 17-year-old boy willing to try almost anything that would alter the status quo. That was what I told myself anyway. Back then, I could lie to myself as effortlessly as I'd lied to that courtier. But now I realized coke hadn't been worth the candle. The risk far outweighed the reward. Threatened with exposure, faced with the prospect of fouling up Granny's Golden Jubilee, walking a knife's edge with the mad press, nothing was worth any of that. On the bright side, I'd played the game well. After I'd called the journalist's bluff, he went silent. As suspected, he had no photo, and when his com game didn't work, he slithered off. Or not quite. He slithered into Clarence's house and became very good friends with Camilla and Per. I was ashamed for lying, but also proud. In a tight spot, a hugely scary crisis, I hadn't felt any serenity, like Granny, but at least I'd managed to project it. I'd channeled some of her superpower, her heroic stoicism. I regretted giving the courtier a cock and bull story, but the alternative would have been 10 times worse. So, job well done. Maybe I wasn't a foundling after all. On Tuesday, the culminating day of the Jubilee, millions watched Granny go from palace to church. A special Thanksgiving service. She rode with Grandpa in a carriage of gold. All of it, every square inch, lustrous gold. Gold doors, gold wheels, gold roof, and on top of it all a gold crown, held aloft by 3 angels cast in glowing gold. The carriage was built 13 years before the American Revolution, and still ran like a top. As it sped her and Grandpa through the streets, somewhere in the distance a massive choir blasted the coronation anthem. Rejoice! Rejoice! We did! We did! For even the grumpiest anti-monarchists, it was hard not to feel at least one goosebump. There was a luncheon that day, I think, and a dinner party, but it all felt a bit anticlimactic. The main event, everyone acknowledged, had taken place the night before, in the gardens outside Buckingham Palace. A performance by some of the greatest musical artists of the century. Paul McCartney sang Her Majesty. Brian May, on the roof, played God Save the Queen. How marvelous, many said. And how miraculous that Granny should be so hip, so modern, that she should allow, indeed relish, all this modern rock. Sitting directly behind her, I couldn't help thinking the same thing. To see her tapping her foot and swaying in time, I wanted to hug her, though of course I didn't. Out of the question. I never had done and couldn't imagine any circumstance under which such an act might be sanctioned. There was a famous story about Mummy trying to hug Granny. It was actually more a lunge than a hug, if eyewitnesses can be believed. Granny swerved to avoid contact, and the whole thing ended very awkwardly, with averted eyes and murmured apologies. Every time I tried to picture the...
Però quando la regina è stata toccata da Michelle Obama ha ricambiato l'abbraccio, quindi proprio si vede che gli stava qua Diana, e quindi in certe occasioni ci atteniamo alle regole, in certe altre le rompiamo.
Scene, it reminded me of a thwarted pickpocketing or a rugby tap tackle. I wondered, watching Granny rock out to Brian May, if Pay ever tried? Probably not. When he was 5 or 6, Granny left him, went off on a royal tour lasting several months, and when she returned, she offered him a firm handshake, which may have been more than he ever got from Grandpa. Indeed, Grandpa was so aloof, so busy traveling and working, he barely saw Per for the first several years of his life. As the concert went on and on, I began to feel tired. I had a headache from the loud music, and from the stress of the last few weeks. Granny, however, showed no signs of fading. Still going strong, still tapping and swaying. Suddenly, I looked closer. I noticed something in her ears. Something gold? Gold as the golden carriage. Gold as the golden angels. I leaned forward. Maybe not quite gold. No, maybe it was more yellow. Yes, yellow earplugs. I looked into my lap and smiled. When I lifted my head again, I watched with glee as Granny kept time to music she couldn't hear, or music she'd found a clever and subtle way of distancing, controlling. More than ever before, I wanted to give my Granny a hug. I sat down with Pa that summer, possibly at Balmoral, though it might have been Clarence's house, where he was now living.
Quindi praticamente la regina aveva le cuffie con cui ascoltava qualcos'altro, evidentemente. Questo ci sta suggerendo Harry. Interessante. Cioè, nel frattempo lei dava l'impressione di ascoltare, magari di essere più moderna, e in realtà poi magari si sentiva Mozart nel frattempo. Interessante. Alla prossima. Saluti reali.